and welcome to this Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition webinar. This month's topic is a very important subject for those of us who are engaged in prison ministry at any level, and that has to do with the getting spiritual direction or giving spiritual direction as a minister. If you have any questions while Sister Barbara is talking, you can write them in the chat and I will pose them to her during the course of our webinar. I want to introduce Sister Quinn. She's going to be our main speaker today. Sister Barbara Quinn has been serving as the Associate Director of Spiritual Formation at Boston College's Clough School of Theology and Ministry since 2011. She's a member of the Society of the Sacred Heart, and she was a founding director of the Center for Christian Spirituality at the University of San Diego. She's taught at all levels and has done administrative work on diocesan, college, elementary school, and parish levels. She has a doctorate of ministry from the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, and she has years of experience in formation and spiritual direction. So thank you, Sister Barbara, for being with us today.
You're welcome. All set to go?
Yes.
Okay. I sort of cringe when I hear the introduction because it's longer and longer and longer, and you know what that means. So I'm very happy to be with you. And my part today is to do a kind of overview of spiritual direction. What is it? How does it work? What's involved? But first, I want to tell you how much I admire the work you do. We have a prison ministry initiative here at the Clough School of Theology and Ministry, where our students go to a prison, several times a week. And I've had the joy of accompanying them on some of those. And it was just wonderful to see the rapport, the dedication the students have, the way the people they're meeting have touched them. I also knew and loved someone who was in prison for 2.5 years. And I came to understand a bit more about the people and the situations that brought them to prison. Each time I would go, I would find myself leaving saying, "There but for the grace of God go I." It could happen to anybody. So I'm just in great admiration for your accompaniment. So what does spiritual direction have to do with prison ministry experience? And I venture to say rather boldly, everything. For the work of spiritual direction is to attune us to God, to ourselves, and to those we encounter. And isn't that what you're doing? Isn't that what's happening to you as you encounter women and men who find themselves in a deep search for the meaning of their lives, just as we do? Isn't that the work of spiritual direction, to search for God in the midst of challenging and painful and hopeful experiences of life? And all the while, we're discovering who we are as we are and who we hope to be. So, what is spiritual direction? Actually, it's an ancient practice offered to women and men who have a real desire to grow in their friendship with God. Centuries and centuries ago, people would seek a holy person whose life was shaped and guided by their relationship with God. They were often, in the old days, women and men who would live a very strict, austere life, often going to the desert so that they could live a kind of uncluttered life, making room for prayer, the study of scripture, to listen more deeply to their hearts, and to meet with people who were seeking guidance from a wise person who desired to grow in friendship with God. Now, over the years, women and men who also desired to grow in friendship with God more often lived their lives, their spiritual lives, in the midst of towns and cities, raising families, doing the kind of work that supported their families, and offering outreach to people in need of help. For example, people in prison who were in their own kind of desert. Now they had to develop ways to pray that were compatible with their lifestyles. A mom and dad of 5 children could not take off to the desert for long stretches, even though I suspect there are some days when they wish they could. Now they had to find God in the midst of work, with spouses and children, with wonderful and cranky neighbors, in world realities like Gaza, Ukraine, the border. asking themselves the same question: where was God in the midst of this way of life? And who are they discovering themselves to be in the search? Both the beauty and the beast in them as in all of us. This is the focus of spiritual direction. For the majority of people now, people like you and like me, who long to sharpen our ability to recognize God's spirit in the everyday events of our life. So, how does it work? The name spiritual direction is actually misleading. A person does not meet with a spiritual director so that the director can tell them what to do. For example, who to marry, what job to take. These decisions are left to you to decide, to me to decide. But hopefully, we desire to make decisions that reflect our own core values, that reflect what we'd like when we are our best and truest selves. And hopefully, our core values include God's values too. Which leads to another question: how do I know what God's values are? And whether God's values have become my values as well? And how does God teach us God's ways? This is where the spiritual director comes in. She or he is a person who can accompany us in our search for God and God's ways, who can help us to recognize the way God's Spirit works and supports us as we search for this in our everyday life. So spiritual direction is better termed actually as spiritual accompaniment. Well, what's involved? The point of spiritual accompaniment is the desire to help a person to be his or her true self and to grow in friendship with God as one's companion and friend on life's journey, so that we can live our lives for others in harmony with this. The two partners in the dialogue, in the search, are God and each of us. So it's essential to gradually recognize who God is on God's terms and who I am when I'm truest and my most authentic self. Then together, God and each of us grow in love, self-giving, the ability to recognize when God is at work in our own hearts, in the lives of others, and in our world. That's the work of discernment, the ability to separate what truly has the marks of God from what is false, not bearing the marks or characteristics of God. That's the work of discernment, our growing ability to recognize, feel, act when we are true to ourselves or when we are trying to be somebody else, when we're less than who we are. It's the human journey, it's the human struggle, it's the human hope that we want to become who we are. And in our culture, there is just a lot of pressure. And I think we all know that. A lot of pressure to say, this is what it means to achieve. This is what success means. This is what makes me important or irreplaceable. But what we're really trying to get at in this is when we really are our true selves, what's that like? What am I like when I'm really at home in my own skin? And we feel that. I like to ask sometimes, who am I when no one's looking? So how does the director help the person to recognize who God really is? I think you probably know this, but there can be some pretty crazy and distorted ideas of God. For example, God sends hard things to us to test us, to punish us, or simply because God just feels like it. Remember, did any of you have marionettes when you were kids? You know, the puppets with these cross hatches, and you'd stand behind a screen and you kind of pull the strings and make them do what they do. That's an image of God, to be honest with you, that some people really do have. It's a capricious God who does what God feels like doing, testing a person by making them lose their job. When a well-meaning minister preaches at the funeral of a premature death of a child or baby saying, oh, God must really love your child to bring the child home to God so soon. I can only say for myself, if that were the kind of God we have, I know I would have no interest in praying to God or wanting a friendship with a God like that. So this is not the God of Scripture. We have got to really do some work in testing out who we think God is, as much as we can think that, as much as we can know that, which we can ultimately. God is mystery way beyond us, and yet so close to us as our own skin. So the director needs to help us examine our concept of God by introducing to us the images of God in Scripture that contradict these crazy ideas. Just this morning, the first reading for today's Mass was from Isaiah. And the last lines say this: "But Zion said, the Lord has forsaken me. My Lord has forgotten me." And God comes back and says, "Can a mother forget her infant? Be without tenderness for the child of her womb? Even should she forget, I will never forget you." Paul's letter to the Romans: "Nothing can separate us from the love of God made visible in Christ Jesus. Not hardships or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or the sword." Imagine how that message resonates with people who are behind bars. The hope that that can offer them. A great resource that I suggest to you that you might want to look up, because it can seem like a daunting task to dig into Scripture if you haven't really had the opportunity to do that or haven't had some help in knowing how to do that. This is a little book called The Diary of Jesus Christ by Bill Kane, a good Jesuit playwright from New York City. He takes the parables of Jesus and imagines if Jesus were to write about those parables, what would Jesus say, to try to crawl into the heart and the mind of Jesus. So one of them, which I'll just use as an example, is one of my favorites, and it's the Last Supper, very important parable. Jesus was at the Last Supper, and he writes in his diary, "This is crazy tonight. The little kids are running under the tables. The women and the men are fighting with each other. The men are all drunk. They're probably picking up my anxiety. What is going on here?" And so Jesus blurts out, "Just love one another. Just love one another. You are my disciples. I call you friends. Just love one another." And some character in the back of the room pipes up and said, "Friends? You never called us friends. We're your disciples, but we're not friends." And Jesus wrote in his diary, "How could I have forgotten that? How could I have missed that?" And then they all go out into the agony of the garden area, and one person stays behind with Jesus and puts her hand on his arm and says, "I always knew that." Mary Magdalene. So it's a humanization more. It's our anthropomorphic way of looking at Jesus to try to understand what went on in his heart, because a lot went on in his heart. And sometimes we don't think we can go near that. The very point of Scripture, though, is to help us enter into the heart of God. So the director also has to help the person remember and reflect on the ways the person may have experienced God, who is loving, forgiving, generous in prayer and life. Maybe it came through a stranger who unknowingly, unexpectedly was so kind. Maybe it comes, I had experience of that, to tell you the truth, at Christmas time. We were at a big concert in Cambridge, and we were going down the stairs. There was a dance involved in this concert. This younger woman took my hand. She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm fine. I'm fine. I only look old." And I thought, that was her kindness. And that was my hang up of saying, "I'm not old." And she was so kind. And I've done that to other people too. What a grace that was for me that night. I think of the breathtaking experience of seeing a sunset and spontaneously praising God for such life, such beauty, and feeling the call to care for our common home in deeper ways. That's grace. That's the experience of God that we all have if we recognize it. So the director helps us to recognize that when he or she, when we are true to ourselves. The thing that I think has become most important to me in spiritual direction and in my prayer is learning the language of God's spirit. God is really smart, and I don't mean that in a flippant way. We are made in the image and likeness of God, but in a way that God's spirit really talks through us as human beings, in our intellects, our hearts, and the way we act. And the language of the spirit registers in each of those areas of our life to say, you're on the right track, you're right with me, or where'd you go? You're off the track a little bit. So the Spirit of God is kneaded into us like yeast into bread, and it's kneaded into the whole of us. If we are thinking truly, then the Spirit of God registers as truth and clarity. I know that. And we know it. That's an instinct. We all know that. If we're not on track with the Spirit of God, then the opposite is true. It's not truthful. There's a falsehood. And we can all kid ourselves about anything we want. At least I believe we can. It's not a truth. It's kind of a falsehood. It's not clarity, but there's just confusion. We've made a decision or tried to make a decision and you think, I don't know. And we just got to wait longer. So we've got to wait longer until we come to a truth and clarity. In our hearts, if we're really in harmony with the Spirit of God, God's Spirit, then there will be a peace and a joy, not superficial, not hilarity, but a deep sense of peace and joy that this is right. And I'm sure that everyone listening to this has known that experience, that it's right. If it's not time for it, or if it's not right, then the opposite is true. There's not peace, there's turmoil. The stomach flips over. We're clenching our jaws. We're snapping at somebody because we're just so ill at ease. There's not peace, but there's turmoil. There's not joy, but there's sadness. And we use that expression. I feel down today. I'm just in the dumps. It's that deep, deep sadness that says something's not right in River City. And finally, in our action, our gut, when we do something, set out to do something, and it's really true to ourselves and true to God, God's values, we'll have a courage and energy to do it, even if it's hard. So I often think of parents who make great sacrifices for their kids. Maybe they wanted to go on that vacation and their kids need new shoes, or we want to pay the tuition for their school, so it's good for them. And there's a real pinch to that, I have no doubt. But there's a courage and energy to do that because it's right, even if it's hard. And the opposite is true. If it's not right, or if it's not time, there won't be courage, there will be fear. And there won't be energy, there will be a kind of paralysis. I can't do it. I'm stuck. I remember making probably the most important decision of my life at one point. And in my head, I knew that I really was sure that this one decision was what was right. I wanted to do it. But when I went to do it, I couldn't do it. And I thought I was going crazy, actually. But when I thought that's not the full signs of the Spirit, I had to give it time. And I gave it time. And within a month, every night I would pray and pray and pray, please, God, make this clear. And then one night, I began to image God, the Spirit, Jesus, of sowing the seeds in the field with Jesus in this one option. And I was sowing the seeds with generosity, but my head was down, I was sweating bullets, and I had this grimace on my face. And I thought, that's not me. When I imagined living the other option, I was upright, I was still doing the very same thing, but it was with another group, and I felt energy and peace, and there was a smile on my face. It's that deeply embedded in us when we pay attention to the signs. So how does it work? How do you get involved in spiritual direction? Well, you find someone you're comfortable with, someone with whom you could share anything you want to share. And sometimes if we're true, I mean, we're not so crazy about everything about ourselves, but we want to find someone who we trust and who we know will really keep great care with what we're saying. The other thing is we need to be willing to pray, to reflect on our day and how God's Spirit was at work and how our true self showed up, or how we were not true to ourselves and why. That's the more important thing. How we turned from God and why. What was the value that became more important? How are we willing to grow little by little to follow God's lead in our true self? To be willing and committed to meeting monthly, to keep on track and really let this be a pattern of our life that works itself in. And finally, Father George Williams will know this. This is part of their meat and potatoes, is St. Ignatius's admonition to do the examen, to take some time every day, really to just look at that and pay attention to where we're heading, towards the Spirit, into God's heart, or away and into myself more and more. So final question, can a lay person have a spiritual director? I wish I could see you right now because I wanted to say, what do you think? And I hope that you say, of course, each of us is a gift of God and is invited to be a friend of God's. And friendship takes two to tango. So we need to make a choice to enter the friendship and to nurture it just the way we would a human friend. The happy news is more and more women and men are being trained this way. So I think Father Williams is going to say a little bit more about that and give you some resources for that. So you may have questions and you can ask them and we can come to that after. Thanks.
There are some questions and we'll get to those in a moment.
Great.
Thank you, Sister Barbara.
Welcome.
Yeah, I think you did a great job of explaining the basics of spiritual direction. I kind of want to focus a little more on those of us who are doing prison ministry and why it's particularly important for us to be involved in this. Actually, any ministry, really, if you're involved in any ministry, you ought to be at least exposing yourself to the gift of spiritual direction in order to help your ministry. But I think it's particularly important with prison ministry. And why is that? Well, if you think about the environment we're working in, that's you're in the trenches. We're in the trenches of where good meets evil, where pain and suffering meet the possibility of liberation and joy. I mean, it's so, one of the things that keeps me coming back to prison ministry is that it's just so real. And the experience of grace can be overwhelming. And also at the same time, you're aware of the presence of shadow, of despair, of deep hurt and deep human brokenness. And so spiritual direction for us, and I mean receiving spiritual direction in this case as prison jail ministers, is important because we need to be able to keep focused on where the light is. Where is God in all of this? Because on a practical level, if we don't do it, we're really risking burnout. I'll get to that in a moment. People don't always like the expression. It sounds kind of like fundamentalist Christians, but the reality is we are on a spiritual battlefield. Now, it's not the prisoners, it's the system that we're dealing with. In a sense, the systems that we have created in the correctional world, in this country at least, in a sense, they can be demonic in the way that we've created institutions of punishment that divide people from their loved ones, that divide them in a sense from their true selves, and that divide communities as a result of mass incarceration. So being aware we're walking into a very complicated, spiritually fraught environment that is a battlefield. Again, we're in the trenches. And as Sister Barbara pointed out, spiritual direction itself, the word is kind of problematic because we're not directing people so much as guiding. Accompanying is a key word here. We know we're involved in prison and jail ministry. It can be very lonely being the chaplain. Often there's nobody else to talk to. to process with. I know in my case, when I would come home from a day on death row, my community didn't really want to hear about serial killers during dinner. So where do I go with this? And that's where spiritual direction really was critical for me in my own ability to stay with this kind of work and grow in it. Where is the Lord speaking to you in the experiences of your life, especially in the day-to-day experiences of prison ministry? And as Sister mentioned, it's all about us growing in our relationship with God, our friendship with God. And in order to be growing in our friendship with God, we need to be praying. And so spiritual direction, being accompanied by a spiritual director is a way of keeping us always coming back to our prayer and paying attention to what's going on in our prayer. That's why the examine is particularly helpful and useful for everybody. Now, I want to also highlight a difference between therapy and spiritual direction, because sometimes people kind of want to use a spiritual direction as a sort of a cheap way of getting therapy, and that's very problematic. I think as a prison ministry or a minister or a jail minister, as a chaplain, or whether you're a paid professional or you're a volunteer, I think it's probably a good idea to do both therapy and spiritual direction. But spiritual direction focuses on where God is working in our lives and where the Spirit is calling us and how we're responding to that call. Treatment therapy can help us discern where we're experiencing psychological blocks in our life that prevent us from being fully open to other people, to ourselves, to the Spirit. They're both healing, but I think it's important that one is really focused on our relationship, our accompaniment with God. The other involves that, but it's also looking at some of the, I hate to say secular, but the things of our lives that impact us from our childhood, that impact us sort of personality issues, addiction issues, anything like that. Again, there's a spiritual dimension to it, but I just want to emphasize that spiritual direction does not take the place of therapy, and therapy does not take the place of spiritual direction. If you can do both, that would be the best thing. Along those lines, I also want to just throw this in. Spiritual direction, like therapy, is a professional relationship, and the people that are serving as spiritual directors have done a lot of training in order to do this kind of work. So it is customary to expect to be paid something for that, and it's up to you and your spiritual director to figure that out. But I think it's important to offer and to expect to be able to pay your director something for their time. Now, going back though to why is it particularly important for us in the prison? Well, remember, it's a spiritual battlefield. It's not because the prisoners are bad people or evil. It's because we're entering into a system that is just fraught with human brokenness. Darkness is real. Evil is real. But at the same time, light is stronger. The light is stronger than the darkness. The darkness has yet to overcome it, as John says, and God is stronger. And I think spiritual direction helps us to avoid the trap of getting kind of hypnotized by where the darkness and the shadow is. One of the things we're always encouraged to do in our prayer is never engage with the evil spirit, in the sense of you don't want to listen to the evil spirit, which the despair, the negativity, the cynicism, that all leads to burnout. And if we try to engage in it, whatever these forces are, they're smarter and stronger than older than we are. And we risk kind of getting burned out. So you want to keep your focus on your speaking to the Spirit and listening to the Spirit, not listening to the other negative forces out there that are real. And we can't minimize them. The other thing I want to point out is that we're talking about you receiving spiritual direction as a jail, prison minister, volunteer, not giving it per se. Unless you've trained in spiritual direction, in the giving of spiritual direction, you should not be doing spiritual direction with prisoners or anybody, because I mean, just the same as if you haven't done medical school, you probably should not be offering your services for giving brain surgery. You're dealing with people's hearts, with their spirits, with their souls. And so we have to approach that with awe, with respect. And not that you ever get to a place where no one's perfect at this, but there are certain basic things that you would get in training for spiritual direction that would be essential before you decide to hang out your shingle and start accompanying people in their prayer. Now, it doesn't mean, though, that you have to then be a certified spiritual director to do prison ministry. Of course not. Most of what we do as prison and jail chaplains is a ministry of presence, a ministry of accompaniment, which it really comes down to listening. And then we can also ask ourselves and the person in front of us, where is God working in them? And how can we meet him or her where they are? Because we're not there to fix people, remember. We're there to support, accompany them as God works to liberate them from whatever it is that got them into this situation. So encouraging, I said, on a practical level, when it comes to prisoners and people in jail, would be encouraging people to pray, teach them different ways of praying, and also being very mindful too, this is important, of the differences of education, language, class, culture. One-on-one spiritual direction in an office somewhere works really well for middle-class white people. Other cultures don't respond in a different way, and some people are more comfortable in group settings. So I think what works for you as depending on your culture may not work for the person sitting in front of you in the prison. So be mindful of that, because the reality is whatever our culture is, God is speaking to us, and the Spirit is calling us, but it's going to manifest itself in different ways in different cultures. And so just to be sensitive to that is important. Helping people learn how to pray more, learn different ways of praying. And then the key is staying with those experiences, going back to them. And this for you, it's both true for the prisoners, it's also true for you. When you're dealing with your spiritual director, what he or she ought to be doing is helping you notice where the Spirit is calling you or present in your prayer in your daily life, and calling you back to staying with those experiences and returning to them, because oftentimes we experience something, we think, oh, that's great, and then we move on from it. But more often than not, there's a great richness that God is trying to share with us, and so we want to go back and kind of mine that and be present to it, and going back several times to an experience. And I just think sometimes, like for me personally, like every day I go to prison, there's some almost overpowering experience of grace that goes on. And I can sort of just say, oh, that was great, and go home and forget about it, or I can keep coming back to it. And when I do, I just, that's where I find God in my own life. That's all I really want to say about prison ministry and spiritual direction for the time being, because I want to get to some of the questions and comments people made. First of all, I wanted to welcome and thank our Kiwi visitor, Nikos, all the way from New Zealand. I can't imagine what time it is there right now, but you mentioned that you're blessed as a chaplain to be regularly accompanied by a spiritual director, and you're interested in knowing more through spiritual accompaniment and how to help the inmates. So, I mean, I think I've spoken to that. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Sister Barbara, in terms of how Nikos, while he's receiving spiritual direction, how can he grow more in his ability to spiritually accompany the inmates in his institutions?
George, I think you said it so well. So I don't have anything to add to it, except that I really want to underline the way you express the evil that's present, that it's not in the prisoners, it's in the system. I think that's so key, and I really appreciate your saying that.
Yeah, and I suppose what I would say, Nikos, is the fact that you're getting spiritual direction is really important. And again, you're there with the prisoners you're there as a ministry of presence and listening, listen to them. And in a sense, the Spirit will teach you and how to be present to them. And I think that's the value of us receiving spiritual direction, is it helps us to be present to the Spirit in our own lives. And then all we're trying to do is help the prisoners be present to the Spirit in their lives. That's not necessarily doing spiritual direction formally, but there are aspects of it that certainly, even if you're not a certified spiritual director, you can certainly help people stay with their prayer, grow in their ability to try different kinds of prayer, and to return to those experiences again and again, and then let God do it. Because ultimately, it's not the spiritual director who's doing the work, or the directee. It's God.
I think there's a phrase that gets used a lot: friendship in the Lord.
Yeah.
Ignatius that was a key phrase for him. And I think that's what prison ministry or any kind of ministry strikes me as, friendship in the Lord. We're all in this.
I think for prisoners especially, I think loneliness is the biggest thing that people suffer from in prison. So this notion that God can be we can have a friendship, a relationship with God who will never abandon us, never leave us. That's important for them to know that that's possible, because I think so many times people in prison are exposed to such horrible, horrible notions of God, and this sort of Calvinist, predestined, judging God who's already condemned them and they're already going to hell anyway. And how do we get past that? Well, I think helping them let go of those negative, horrible ideas of the kind of God that Sister Barbara mentioned, who I wouldn't want to pray to a God like that. But the real spirit, the true spirit in the world, who is through Jesus, who is able to be their friend, and that's something that I think they can relate to on many different levels. Okay, this is a good point, Sister Barbara. If you could kind of maybe speak to the difference between spiritual conversation and spiritual direction, because I think that would be across the board, whether in or out of prison ministry, important and useful.
I think one of the differences between spiritual conversation is just a wonderful natural thing. When it comes to spiritual direction, there is a weight on the side of the person who's speaking and sharing. That's the focus of attention is there, that the real call is to pay attention to how God is working in that person. So in a spiritual conversation, sometimes it's much more mutual, it seems to me. But in spiritual direction, it's not for the director to rehearse or, to talk about what happened to me in my prayer today. I think it's a natural thing sometimes to share something if it's appropriate, but really the accent is on the person there. So that's a distinction I would make.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, in a prison, we're having conversations all the time. So I think it's kind of built into the work that we're doing. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to kind of go back a little bit to the notion of paying. I don't want to make it sound like across the board you have to approach this as a transactional relationship. However, if you think about it, historically, often it was a minister or say a priest or a sister or a brother who lived in a community who was able to do this as a part of their pastoral ministry that would not be charged any more than you charge people to go to communion. But the world we live in now is much different. And oftentimes you have people who are lay men and women who've been trained as spiritual directors, who have families. And so the assumption that this is a free pastoral gift needs to at least be worked out with your spiritual director. Don't assume that it's always free. At least offer the person to pay for their services. And if they say no, great. But I think it's important that we have to be aware that we're not dealing with this. The spiritual direction, like everything else in the church, is changing with the times we're living in. Someone says here, I'm very interested in becoming involved, but they say they're blind, and this limits their ministry to being Zoom. That would not be a limitation. I mean, it would be for working in the prison per se. Because normally prisoners are not allowed to communicate by Zoom with people, but you can certainly do spiritual direction virtually. You can do it online. We did it during COVID. And so I think if a person's had some limitation that prevented them from going in to meeting one-on-one, but we actually have blind prison chaplains. So I think it may not be a limitation as much as for some people. So there are ways that you can, there are ways of doing prison, there are ways of doing spiritual direction without being physically in the same room with the person. Hopefully that addresses what you're asking.
George, I can't hear you too well. If you could speak up a little bit more.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the person mentioned the difficulty of being blind and how would that prevent him from participating. And it shouldn't, because you can certainly do spiritual direction, either receiving it or giving it by Zoom. And even in terms of prison ministry, oftentimes it's not impossible to go in. That we have deaf, we have blind volunteers who come in and work with the prisoners, and we certainly have blind and deaf prisoners who need that kind of support.
I would add to that too. There is a Jesuit priest in Buffalo, Larry Gillick, mm-hmm. who is blind, and I've heard a number of people who have gone to him, and he is top notch. And mm-hmm. I think there's something, I can't speak from my own experience of this, but I think when someone is doesn't have a particular capacity, you make up for it in another way and compensate for it. And so someone who is blind has a sensitive hearing that picks up on things that maybe not would not be picked up by people who are looking right at you. So I don't think that has to be a limitation at all.
Yeah, yeah. And I hope people can sort of challenge any limitations that the system might put on them, because we all have something to offer. Someone asked how we can share spiritual accompaniment with returning citizens after they've been released from prison. That's a great question. And that would be a great ministry to work with people who are coming out of the system back into the community.
I can't hear you, George.
Okay, I don't know why I'm becoming more hard to hear, but the person wants to know about doing spiritual accompaniment with people after they've been released from prison. And I think that's a great idea. And I think there's certainly ways you can do that. It would be pretty much an extension of whatever people do in prison ministry. While you're working with people on the inside, it would be the same working people on the outside. You could meet with them individually or in groups and focus on their prayer, what's going on in their lives, because it's the spiritual direction draws not just from the moments we're praying, but from everything in our lives, our daily experiences. God speaks to us in all kinds of ways during our days. And so helping people to be attentive to where the Spirit is moving in their lives now that they're out of the institution and they're working in the community or they're living in the community. It would be really, I think it'd be really critically helpful for people, because that's such a difficult time of transition for people when they leave prison and go to the community. Somebody asked here, wouldn't it help if the spiritual director has done prison ministry? Absolutely. And I've been blessed in the last 20 years of my life. I've had two spiritual directors who were involved in prison ministry, but also I have a spiritual director who never did prison ministry. So I think, yes, it's a value. It's wonderful. It kind of adds an extra level, an extra dimension of understanding on the part of the director to what it's like going into the prison for the directee. But it's not essential. It's not necessary. As long as the person who's being the spiritual director accompanying you is able to kind of take what your experience and help you focus, return to it, stay with it, hear, where is God working in this? Having been a prison ministry would not be a prerequisite for being a spiritual director for those of us who are doing prison ministry, but it certainly would be a help. Do you know any programs that offer spiritual direction as part of reentry work? No, not off the top of my head. I'm not familiar with anything like that. But again, I think that's like so many areas that we've discovered in Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition over the past couple of years is there's so many possibilities for expressions of prison and jail ministry. They're not necessarily involved going into a prison. So this would be a wonderful idea that you could explore on your own and find out what's going on in your community. Is there any kind of resource for meeting with people who are returning citizens? I think that would be a great addition to what we're trying to do across the board in the prison ministry world here. Somebody said I sent a list of spiritual directors trained at Spring Hill College to Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition. And how does the CPMC intend to assist prison ministries in connecting with a spiritual director? We're working on that now. And at the end, I'm going to show you a form that we have on our website that is exactly intended to do this, where you can sign up, and we're going to try to help people find spiritual directors who are available specifically to work with us who are working in prison ministry. So thank you for that question. And I will get to that when we do our announcements. We're also going to be having a town hall in March. We had a town hall that should address some of that. Do you know, Sister Barbara, of any reentry programs through the volunteers at Boston College? I know there had been for many years a prison ministry group at the theology school there. I think it's still going.
Yeah, it is. It is. They're in fact, they're more robust this year than they have been for a while. There probably are about 15, 20 students involved, and they're going regularly to the prison out at MCI Concord, which is closing this summer. So that's, I don't know where they'll be able to go from there. Norfolk is a little bit farther out, but they're really dedicated.
Mm. I'd recommend they if they haven't gone to Framingham, that they get in
Yeah.
touch with Sister Maureen and go there, because that won't be closing anytime soon, unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Cheryl asks, wouldn't it help if the spiritual director has done prison ministry? Yeah, of course, it would help. And I think if it's possible to find somebody who's done has done prison ministry, is doing spiritual direction, great. But I would want to emphasize, though, that it would necessarily be a liability if the person hadn't done prison ministry. That a person, you can do spiritual direction with in any number of settings, with any number of people, different experiences. I think the real key for us is becoming more adept at understanding cultural differences and different modalities of doing spiritual direction in other cultural settings. Dealing with people who may not be comfortable with like a one-on-one sort of session, but maybe more comfortable sharing in groups. I found that to be true, especially with some of our Spanish-speaking prisoners. They really enjoy kind of sharing in small groups, where one-on-one it might be more awkward for them. So not that they can't do it, but it's just what kind of flows more out of their cultural experiences, and where do they feel most comfortable. We want to try to meet people again where they are, and not sort of be careful not to impose a certain mindset on them that if it worked for me in my setting, well, it's going to work for everybody. Well, no, because not everybody had my background or my cultural expectations.
I would say one of the programs that is at MCI Concord is a Catholic night. I attended a couple of those, and I must say it was terribly moving.
Is that Catholic Life?
Yes.
Catholic, yeah, I started that group. Yeah.
Did you? Well, yeah. It's going strong, George, and it is so inspiring.
And it's a good example of what happened. Was it took a few weeks for them to kind of get to a place of trust, especially in prison. But once they did, it became a really very powerful opportunity for people to experience. In a sense, it's kind of a spiritual accompaniment. I wouldn't call it direction, but it's close to it.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear it's still going. This person says, I'm a full-time spiritual director, and I've also been a prison ministry volunteer for many years. I recently felt called to explore spiritual direction with returning citizens. I think Sharon, we will definitely get back to you about that. I think my sense is there's probably a whole wide open field out there of something not being done, but nothing's stopping you from exploring yourself and seeing what's possible in your own area with returning citizens, because there are plenty of them, and they certainly need that kind of support. So anything else you'd like to add, Sister Barbara, before we wrap up?
This one comes from, Courtney, can you speak a little bit about how there are different ways of doing spiritual direction? I didn't get the whole question coming up. Is that what it was, pretty much?
Yeah, in addition to say an Ignatian approach, some other traditions.
I have had, excuse me, a lot of training in the Ignatian approach, and I respect it very much. I also think there are other ways to look at it, and that we have a lot to learn from other traditions. I think it's not a matter of scripting and saying this is 1, 2, 3, how you do it. It's a matter, really, I think, of knowing God as well as we can, and having the feeling for the ways of the Spirit, and listening to that in another person. If something from the Ignatian tradition helps a person understand what's happening, great, pull it. The Carmelite tradition has a great deal to offer, especially in darkness. I think that would be so appropriate for the folks that you're meeting, that there are periods of horrible darkness, I suspect, and that the Carmelite way of talking about that and understanding that is, sometimes it's dark because it's dark, and sometimes it's a way of saying, I really am hungry for God more than I ever realized. So I think to pull on anything that really helps us understand the ways of God and the Spirit is works. Not works, it's just a good thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I guess I would, in sort of wrapping up, I would want to sort of really emphasize or stress this is really important for you to be availing yourself of this opportunity to receive spiritual direction if you're doing this kind of ministry in jails or prisons. I can't imagine not doing it because I think I would burn out in a month if I didn't have that. So it's important that you, if you're not doing it already, if you're not, find a spiritual director. And again, I'm going to get to that in a moment, how you can do that. And it just will help in terms of your own prayer life, in terms of your ability to thrive in the setting that God has called you to work in. Because really, this ultimately, we're only doing this work because God has called us to it. No one in their right mind would say, "Oh, I want to go to prison today." So we're there because God has called us, and God is continuing to call us, and we need to be attentive to God's voice in all of this because it's going to change over time too. Our prayer will change in different times of our life, as well as our understanding of our relationship with God. So this is one way of keeping us grounded in that friendship with God. And so if Courtney, if you could put up that sign-in sheet for the spiritual direction, this will be on our website, and it's basically just a way for you to, if you're interested, to fill this out. And it's a way for us to then have some information so then we can start matching people with directors. And we're looking for people who are interested in direction, also people who are interested in providing spiritual direction as well. So please go on our website and complete this interest form if you are looking for a spiritual director. So Sister Barbara, thanks so much for your presence today, your work, and say hi to my friends at Boston College.
I will.
And appreciate your time. And thank you all for joining us. And
thank you.
Thank you.